Fear and the threat of arbitrary, casual death was everywhere.
At one point I remember just working, and then they just walk up and just shoot the person in the head. You know, the guy just walk up and go boom.
In fact, most of Pol Pot's victims were killed not by bullets, but beaten to death with blunt instruments.
We still didn't know who Pol Pot was. We didn't know what kind of a man he was. We didn't know what he looked like. And I remember just hearing all these accolades and praise about this mighty person, this strong person, this person who loved us, this person who wanted to bring our country back to its glory days.
In Pol Pot's peasant utopia, starvation claimed most lives. The huge influx of city people into the rural areas meant there was not enough rice to feed them. Even the peasants themselves began to starve.
And indeed, rice was withdrawn and exported by the party centre while these people were dying in massive numbers of starvation.
Life wasn't even cheap to Pol Pot. It had no value at all. Even today, the exact number of mass graves into which the victims' bodies were thrown is not known.
You know, Pol Pot was a remarkable man. He was generous, he was kind, he was loving, almost grandfatherly. He had all of the characteristics of a great leader. There are a lot of Cambodians who don't believe that what happened under Pol Pot in fact was his doing, because he was too good a man. Pol Pot believes that what he did for the good of his country.
Few Westerners ever got to meet Pol Pot whilst he was in power. One who did was American journalist Elizabeth Becker, who interviewed him in 1978.
What struck me first was that he was much more handsome and a charming smile. There was some charm to the man. And we were told to sit down, put the cameras away, and we were to sit there and listen to Pol Pot. And when the time was up, the time was up, and he said goodbye.
With her was another journalist, Dick Dudman, and British academic Malcolm Caldwell. To Caldwell, he was more indulgent.
He told Malcolm Caldwell how wonderful the communist experiment was in Cambodia. Two totally different interviews. One was a lecture and the other was an interview.
Later that night, back at their hotel, an unremarkable meeting with Pol Pot was about to turn into an unforgettable nightmare.
A few hours later, I woke up because I could smell cordite, you know, the smell of a gun being fired. And then I heard shots on the second floor. Lots of shots. I didn't count them, but lots and lots of shots. And so I went upstairs, and Malcolm's body was on the floor, and, you know, white with death. The gunman walked in and murdered Malcolm. Why Malcolm? The friend, the one friend of the regime, and not us. Some documents suggest that it would have been me. Another one suggested that it was Caldwell. Why, it doesn't make any sense, but nothing makes sense there. Needless to say, after all that, I couldn't imagine how Cambodians lived through almost 4 years of that. I mean, what I went through in 2 weeks, they lived through 4 years and saw their whole lives, their whole country, everything destroyed.
Within 2 years of Pol Pot coming to power, hundreds of thousands of Cambodians lay rotting in mass graves. Starvation, overwork, and summary execution had all taken its toll on the city people and the peasants.
To prove yourself worthy to be kept alive, you have to be productive in the field. You have to be a productive person. They were monsters. But we didn't see them. I didn't see them as human beings.
He never accepted that he was responsible for any of the suffering. He never accepted that any of the people who died were executed for anything but the right reason. And for him to admit the slightest remorse or the slightest responsibility would be intolerable.
Compelled by the racism that was so much a part of his agenda, Pol Pot turned his attention to Cambodia's ethnic minorities.
The Chinese were probably the largest ethnic minority in Cambodia, and half of those perished in the Pol Pot period.
The ethnic Chams, the ethnic Muslims, were the ones who were particularly targeted and just slaughtered.
Pol Pot's most extreme persecution was reserved for the Vietnamese who lived in Cambodia.
There were reports in the Khmer Rouge period of Cambodian men married to Vietnamese being instructed to kill their Vietnamese wives. Husbands who had been married to Vietnamese were also killed. People who could speak Vietnamese were also killed. People who looked Vietnamese were also killed. There are no confirmed reports of any ethnic Vietnamese surviving the entire Pol Pot period.
Yet while Pol Pot's control over Cambodia grew, so did his paranoia. Midway through his reign of terror, he began to see enemies everywhere, even amongst his own supporters.
There was a huge bloodletting in 1977. Purge teams travelling around to other zones, purging the leaderships, killing them, killing their family members, reaching down into the peasantry for their relatives who were suspect and killing them as well.
When he took over in 1975, there were 22 members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. By the end of his reign in power, 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days later, 18 of those 22 members of the Central Committee had been executed.
Most of the executions took place at an old school called Tul Sleng. Known as S21, it was established by Pol Pot to torture and kill his political enemies. In less than 4 years, Pol Pot sent between 14 and 20,000 people to S21. Men, women and children were tagged, photographed, and almost all were tortured into confessing.
The whole ideology of the place was that because they were arrested, they were guilty. They must be, because the party was never wrong. It never makes mistakes.